newer people, say where you're from and maybe what your connection is to Jon. So let's see, I better call on us one by one. How about Sherry? Where are you located?
I'm in Santa Rosa, California, and
oh, cool.
I'm honored to be Jon's girlfriend.
Hey, wow. That's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've been following what he's been doing for a while, and it's been fascinating, and I'm grateful to be here.
Okay.
Good deal.
I keep showing up with all these books, you know.
I'm more than just Jon's girlfriend. I'm an artist and a poet, and I have a life too. So.
Oh, well,
that's the best thing about it.
Susan, where are you located?
I'm in Paradise Valley, Arizona.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Definitely. Sure.
Okay.
For sure.
All right, great. Is it hot there?
116.
Oh, you're kidding.
It's a little warm.
Gosh.
Hot enough.
You just get used to it. You just get used to it.
That's plenty. And Randy, how about you?
It's fertile, not fertile, by the way. And I'm in New Orleans, where it's in the 90s. And I'm afraid I do not know Jon's work. I look forward to learning about it.
Terrific. Covadonga, tell us about you.
Yes, my name is Covadonga. I'm from Spain, and I am in Memphis, Tennessee right now.
Ah.
Oh, yeah. I didn't recognize your Memphis accent.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Let's see. How about Susan Schwartz? Tell us about you.
She just
I just said where I was from. Yes.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I did.
Yeah,
thank you.
It was Susan Scott that didn't answer those.
Okay.
So Susan Scott, go ahead.
Hi. I live in Plettenberg Bay, which is on the southern tip of South Africa. Nighttime here, it's about 8:05. Temperature probably about 5 degrees Celsius. And also very much looking forward to participating, listening in, and to Jon's talks that I'll definitely be catching up on soon. So thank you very much for the invitation to join in.
You're quite welcome. Glad I remembered. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Abby, how about you?
I live in Bodega, California, near the, got interested in this lecture series that was started at the senior center there. So I'm happy to be following up because I'm very interested in this topic.
Yeah, I gave first lecture just as COVID was starting to raise its head here, and then everything was canceled. So
wow,
still working on them, and grateful to have the opportunity to present parts of them here.
That's great. Well, there's a bunch of other people that aren't on camera, but I don't know how many of you have access to a microphone, but is there anybody else who wants to introduce themselves?
My name is Idris. I live in British Columbia, Canada. I love psychology, and more than that, I love the group here. Every day we learn so much and we interact with each other. Amazing friends.
My name is Kalena, and I'm somewhat of a neighbor of Sherry and Abby. I live in Sebastopol, California.
Perfect.
That's where I am too, Sebastopol.
Great.
Hello, everybody.
My name is Miles Fligg. I'm actually from the same traditional territory as Tim Holmes is, and that is the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Niitsitapi people, stretches from Yellowstone Park north to the North Saskatchewan River near Edmonton, Alberta, the Rocky Mountains on the west, and over some distance to the east. I'm here because of Jordan Peterson, then finding a pastor named Paul Vanderclay, then on December 11th, 2018, encountered Skip in a comment, and the rest is history.
And I so rarely comment. And Nancy Paff is from Reno, Nevada. And Randy Fertel is one of the authors in Jung's Red Book for Our Time. We're currently discussing a presentation that will feature him. Maxie Purrington is a well-known personality in the Carl Jung depth psychology world. Thomas Weber, how about you? Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so I think we've dilly-dallied long enough, John, and so I'm going to put you on speaker view and pin you to the video so that it's your turn to talk.
Yeah, so I need to be able to share my screen here.
Okay, just a minute. Let me make you co-host. Sorry. There you go.
All right. All right, so everybody can see that?
Yep. Looks good.
Okay, I'm gonna move this out of the way here. So please feel free to jump in, to comment, along the way. And I think we'll have a great discussion from this one. This is my series, A Psychological Approach to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And the topic today, women in the Bible, which is a great topic, very feisty and some great stories. So I'm going to start with the statement that anyone's position on how women are portrayed in the Bible is essentially a Rorschach test. Rorschach, came out of Freud's ilk and developed this massive test of a massive collection of ink blots, and they whittled it down to a smaller collection, and that's the Rorschach test. I've actually taken the test myself, but I've never administered it to anyone. And this is one of the classic images. What you're supposed to see in that image is two women. But if by chance you happen to notice or think or believe that they have penises, that used to be considered a sign that you were gay. So that's how these things work. And I think today's whole presentation is basically going to be a bit of a Rorschach test. And we'll get to that in a moment. It all depends on what you already believe, I think, in terms of how you interpret things. And as with most subjects, the Hebrew Bible presents diverse opinions about women. Not unexpected. This is Rabbi Tamar Eskenazi. Basically, women are shown in the Bible holding any position in society except priesthood. And I think I mentioned last time that to put that in perspective, 90% of the men in the Hebrew culture in those days could not be priests either, only the Levites and only the men of the Levites. But that's the one exception in terms of the roles that women could play. And some women had more than one position, such as Deborah, who was a prophet, a military leader, and a judge. during the time of the judges before the kings. Most of the women in the Hebrew Bible show up as rescuers, and most of the women in the Hebrew Bible are positive characters. It's the interpretation, it's all the stuff that surrounds these stories. It's the interpretation of the stories about women that has been negative and blaming and denigrating in some circles. Again, Rabbi Ashkenazi, until we understand why it was chosen to interpret the Bible in the ways that debase or devalue women, we're not in a position to adequately deal with gender issues. I think that's a pretty accurate statement. I like her work also, by the way. So the Hebrew Bible is, in fact, very much a patriarchal book. That was partly their intent. They were surrounded by a culture that had goddess worship and other gods. They intended to be patriarchal, in a particular male patriarchal monotheistic God. But its approach to patriarchy is complicated. And it's not exactly what you think necessarily. And there are texts that demean women, that's certainly true. Some authors refer to terror texts, texts that are terrorizing of women and about women. There are texts that are empowering women, and there are many that give complicated and mixed messages. But at times, the ancient Hebrews seem to be mocking the patriarchy. And time again in these old stories, men have the authority, but it's women that have the power, and they use it. And that's what we'll see today in these stories. And of course, feminist writers, feminist scholars are, of course, interested in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Feminist theology, biblical criticism has become well established from secular, Jewish, and Christian perspectives. And feminist scholars, they tend to see gender roles, you know, the idea of like, what does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? How do you behave if you're male? How do you behave if you're female? How do you dress if you're male? How do you dress if you're female? Feminist scholars would say that's all constructed. There's nothing natural or normal about that in itself. It's our culture that tells us what those roles are. And also, feminist authors will tend to see gender as intersecting with other issues such as race and class. As an example, we look at Jezebel. What would a feminist scholar ask about Jezebel? Well, was she truly evil to begin with? And how much of what happened to her was because she was a woman? How much because she was Black? And how much because she was an immigrant? I think all of those things do play into it, but actually there's another much bigger issue, I think, and we'll see that later. Postmodern feminist scholars that talk about text and context might ask, well, why is it that women, if you look at the Hebrew text, if you look at the Greek text, women come off better in those translations as compared to the English translations? And why is that? Why is it that they're worse in English? That's a very good question to ask, and I'm not actually going to answer it today. I'm going to just leave it. And then there's this. This is just one example. It illustrates the world of women to some extent in the Hebrew Bible from Leviticus. A woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will ceremonially be unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised, and then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. If she gives birth to a daughter, for 2 weeks, not 7 days, but 2 weeks, the woman will be unclean as during her period. And then she must wait 66 days, not 33 days, 66 days to be purified from her bleeding. These are the regulations for the woman who gives birth to a boy or a girl. She is to bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And in this way, the priest will make atonement for her and she will be clean. the ancient Hebrews just had this thing about blood. And it shows up in many different ways in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and particularly about women. And so much so that this is a totally different world that lives parallel to the world that we see in the Old Testament, the world of women. If you would like to read a little more about that, I really recommend this book, The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, which takes you deep into that world and gives you a real sense of how it worked and what the rules were and how different it was actually from the male world in the Old Testament. So this is the Women's Bible, 1898. It was the first really of the scholarly commentaries written by women about the Bible, about the Old Testament in particular, edited by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a committee of 26 women. Now, these women did not have degrees, they weren't trained, but they wrote commentary about portions of the Bible. It was the first example of that. More recently, this is another really good series, the Feminist Companion to the Hebrew Bible. It's now a large number of books edited by Athalia Brenner, and I think those are worthy. And probably sitting on the top of the pile, the top of the mountain, is the Women's Bible Commentary, 3rd edition. Came out in 2012, edited by Carol Newsom and others. And this is a really tremendously good book. I do recommend this if you're interested in this sort of thing. Another look and interpretation of the stories. Now, I mentioned as we were starting that I would start with a woman who's not in the Bible, or is she? She is mentioned, but it's Lilith. And Lilith was basically Adam's first wife. It's an interesting story. And where does this come from? Well, it comes from the fact that we have two different creation stories in Genesis. Genesis 1 is the 6 days of creation, and then the 7th day is in the beginning of chapter 2. And then chapter 2, we have Adam and Eve. Now, in chapter 1, God creates humans in the image of God, male and female created he them simultaneously. But in chapter 2, we have Adam being put to sleep and a rib being built into Eve, a sequential thing, which people have put a lot of interpretations on, but they're two different stories. Now, to the ancient Hebrews, that was no big deal. It was not uncommon in cultures all around in that area, in that time, to have different stories that contradicted each other. And that wasn't the point, according, the Hebrews didn't care about that. They cared about the moral point of the story. They cared about monotheism, and they cared about the things that they were trying to teach. They did not care that the stories contradicted each other. But we Westerners do care about things like that. And it's interesting, the theories that have come out of it. Lilith, of course, though, comes out of Hebrew or rabbinical mythology, Jewish mythology, and first appears, 3rd century, 5th century CE, AD. Comes out of the Babylonian Talmud. And in Jewish folklore, Lilith is Adam's first wife, created at the same time and from the same clay as Adam. So this is how they're making sense of the fact that there are these two stories, that in Genesis 1, it was a different woman than in Genesis 2. Lilith refused to be subservient to Adam, and she left the Garden of Eden after she had sex with the archangel Samael. Now, Samael is another character out of rabbinical wisdom. Some of these interpreters say that Samael was the angel that wrestled with Jacob. And some say that Samael was the Satan in the book of Job, who challenged God as to the character of Job. Lilith later goes on to become a demon of the night. She's sexually promiscuous, and she steals babies from their cribs. And I asked a question a time or two ago, has anybody heard of this or know anyone who has done this? But it's an old superstition that you take yellow ribbon and tie it around the perimeter of your baby's crib to keep Lilith from coming and stealing your child. Now, Lilith actually does come probably out of a long, old tradition. So many of these stories, either Mesopotamian, either Babylonian or older, Sumeria, the Lilithu, a class of female demons, perhaps like Tiamat. So just to back up for a moment and look at the things that I've said here about Lilith. She refused to be subservient. She had sex with an archangel. She is sexually promiscuous, and she steals babies from cribs. And what I'm going to suggest is that this is what happens to women in the Old Testament. This is the charge that is laid on them if they go awry. And we'll see that these very same things get said as we go along. So as we start to look at women in the Bible, I think a good place to start is Eve. Interestingly, Eve is one of the most developed women in the Bible. We get to see her inner monologue, and we get to understand her and know her better than we know almost anybody else, in the Old Testament. It's very interesting. So starting with Genesis 2, God has already made Adam from the dust of the earth and breathed the breath of life into him. And then the Lord God planted a garden in Eden to the east, and he placed there a human he had fashioned. And the Lord God caused to sprout from the soil every tree lovely to look at and good for food. And the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge, good and evil. So first of all, just to point out that this thing about good and evil is what scholars call a merism. It's a connection of opposites. We as people who appreciate Carl Jung, we appreciate the idea of opposites. And that's exactly what the Hebrews are doing here. It doesn't mean good, it doesn't mean evil. It means good and evil and everything in between. It's the tree of all knowledge. So they do this a lot. You'll see this all through the Hebrew Bible, this use of opposites. And what it means is the totality of the thing. And the Lord God took the human and set him down in the Garden of Eden. Now, I've always wondered, where was the human created if it wasn't in the Garden of Eden? But he was taken to the Garden of Eden to till it and to watch it. And then the Lord God commanded the human, saying, from every fruit in the garden you may surely eat, but the tree of knowledge, good and evil, you shall not eat, for on that day you eat of it, or from it, you're doomed to die. This is one of the curious things about this story, and there are several points in this story, is what did that mean to Adam? He's going to die. I mean, at this point, up until the flood, human beings were vegetarians. It's only after the flood that they were allowed to eat meat. So there's not even the death of animals. What is God talking about? What is Adam understanding that he's doomed to die? I mean, that's a mystery to me. The Lord God said, it is not good for the human to be alone. I shall make him a sustainer beside him. And the Lord had first he praised all the animals past Adam, and it doesn't work. And then the Lord God cast a deep slumber on the human, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed over the flesh where it had been. And the Lord God built the rib he had taken from the human into a woman And he brought her to the human, and the human said, a nice bit of poetry, "This one at last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, this one shall be called woman, for from man this one was taken." So I want to point out these words. It's not good that the human should be alone. We just spent the whole first chapter of Genesis with God saying, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. First time that we hear anything like this, that it is not good in creation. All of the trees of the garden, all of the animals in the garden were good, everything. So that's interesting. And a sustainer. In the King James, it's a helpmeet. Some translators say that this word should be a rescuer, that it's not good for the human to be alone. He can't do it. He needs a helper. He needs a sustainer. He needs a rescuer. And that is the origin of Eve. One of his ribs, and built the rib. A lot of people put emphasis on the word built, that there's a particular dignity to that. But ribs, selah, 41 times in the Old Testament, this word appears, and only twice is it translated as ribs. 20 of the times it's rendered, it means the side of the man or the person or the thing, and 12 times is a side chamber. In its Semitic root, selah has the idea of limping or turning from side to side. So I'm not going to go too deep into it, but a lot of commentators really talk about this word built. And it's not a secondary thing at all. Now that's the creation story. And in chapter 3, something new happens. Now the serpent was the most cunning of all the beasts in the field that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, "Though God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden." And the woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of the garden's trees we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it, and you shall not touch it, lest you die." And the serpent said to the woman, "You shall not be doomed to die, for God knows that on the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will become as gods, knowing good and evil, knowing everything." So first of all, it wasn't a snake, it was a serpent, a symbol of chaos, which was conquered, divided, and controlled in Genesis chapter 1. Now chaos is rearing its head again in the midst of creation. And a very interesting thing here, the serpent says, God said, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden. And the woman, Eve, interrupts the serpent. It says, no, from the garden's trees we may eat, but from this one tree we can't. So there's a conversation going on here. And she boldly interrupted what the serpent was saying. And then she says, not only do you not eat from it, you shall not touch it, lest you die. Well, where did Eve get that idea? It's not what God said to Adam or the Adam. Where did she get this idea? Well, we don't know. In rabbinical teachings, some of them say that what happens at this point is the serpent reaches out and pulls Eve into the tree. Poof. And he says, see, you didn't die, did you? For God knows. That's an interesting thing that he's saying. this is, is it a deception or is it the truth? God knows that on the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will become as gods, knowing good and evil, knowing everything. The woman saw that the tree was good for eating, and that it was lust to the eyes, and the tree was lovely to look at. And she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her man, and he ate. And the eyes of the two were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. There's a lot packed into this little bit of verse here. First thing I want to show you, I might have mentioned this last time. This is Hebrew storytelling. It's all through the Old Testament. It's not in the English translations. For whatever reason, this storytelling method doesn't come across in the English. But the Hebrews did this sort of thing. And each action is separated into a distinct thing. And the woman saw that the tree was good for eating, and that it was lust to the eyes, and the tree was lovely to look at, and she took of its fruit, and ate, and she also gave to her man, and he ate, and the eyes of the two were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves, and made themselves loincloths. This, I think, is, I mean, there are many things, but this is a huge bit of evidence that this was originally oral storytelling. You can hear the chant, you can hear the song, you can hear the rhythm of it, you can hear the people moving in response to this story being told. Now, this is an important bit of the story. She also gave to her man, and what many commentators say, and this illustration on the left shows, he was standing there the whole time, listening to this conversation. He didn't say a word. And she eats the fruit. He doesn't say anything or do anything. She hands it to him. He eats the fruit. He was there the whole time. That's an interesting thing to think about. And this bit, they knew that they were naked. Now, this was the tree of all knowledge. All knowledge. And what did they learn? What vast things did they know about the universe and about life and about anything? Well, the one thing we're told is that they knew that they were naked. Now, some people say that that means they realized that they were vulnerable. Some people say this was the dawning of sexual awareness. Some commentators say they didn't notice before that they were different. I don't know, but at this point, they know that they're naked, and that is the sum total of what they got from eating the fruit. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking about in the garden in the evening breeze, and the human and his woman hid from the Lord God in the midst of the trees of the garden. God calls out, saying, "Where are you?" Adam says, "I am here." And Adam said, "I heard your sound in the garden, and I was afraid, for I was naked and hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? From the tree I commanded you not to eat, have you eaten?" And the human said, "The woman whom you gave me, she gave me from the tree, and I ate." And the Lord God said to the woman, this is God actually talking to the woman, "What is this you've done?" And the woman said, the serpent beguiled me, and I ate." So this is an interesting question. I even wrote a poem once that had this title and dove into this, but who told you that you were naked? There's a play going on here, and it's very interesting. Now, I've read very, very conservative commentators who look at this story and, Well, what have you done? God says to Adam. Oh, it was the woman. Well, what have you done? Eve says, oh, it was the serpent. And I've heard very conservative commentators say, you know, if they had just owned up to it, if they just said, oh, yeah, I know you told me not to do this. I did it. I don't know why. I don't know what I was thinking, or this is what I was thinking. But anyway, I'm sorry. These commentators say maybe it could have all been forgiven right there if they just owned it. I think that's an interesting interpretation. It's a little bit outside the story, but it's an interesting interpretation. So to the woman, he said, I will sharply sharpen your birth pangs, and in pain shall you bear children, for your man shall be your longing, and he shall rule over you. There's a lot of commentary and interpretation about what this means. Your birth pangs, and in pain shall you bear children. Well, is it about the pain of being pregnant and giving birth and labor and delivery? Maybe it is. Or as some people have said, a slightly different interpretation or translation is that it's the pain of raising children. It's the pain of having a child, worrying about a child, seeing the child develop, being in conflict with your child, losing your child moving away. All of those things are the pain. It's probably all of those things. It's also a kind of a just so story, as Marie-Louise von Franz would say. Why do women have pain when they give birth? Well, they do. Basically what we're hearing here. The woman said, God said to the human, because you listened to the voice of your wife and ate from the tree that I commanded you, you shall not eat from it. Cursed be the soil for your sake. With pangs shall you eat from it all the days of your life. Thorn and thistle shall it sprout for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat the bread until you return to the soil, for from there you were taken. For dust you are, and dust you shall return to dust. Or dust also is soil. Basically, Adam is the same thing. Pangs, pain. Cursed be the soil, and with pain and pangs shall you eat from it all the days of your life. Basically, both of them are told life is going to be hard. It's going to be difficult, complicated. This phrase, I like to point out, Adam, the Adam, is being punished because he listened to the voice of his wife. But that's the very thing that Abraham was complimented on when he listened to Sarah. Because you listened to the voice of your wife. That was a good thing in that later story. So don't know if we can quite land on that as heavily as many people do. Oh, one other thing as we go along. Oh, I'll come to it in a moment. So Lord God said to someone, now that the human has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, knowing all things, he may reach out and take as well from the tree of life and live forever. Now, in many cultures of the world, it's not unusual to have a tree of life. It's not a one-time thing. You don't eat of it and live forever. You eat of it and stay alive. And there was only one tree that was forbidden in the garden. It was the tree of knowledge. So probably the Adam and Eve have been eating of this tree all along, and now they're going to be cut off from it and sent out from the garden. And he drove the human and set up east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flame of the whirling sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Cherubim were not little cute creatures. they were monsters. And the flaming sword would be a pretty scary thing. I think, we're basically curious apes. A little cherub would not keep us from going back into that garden. So now, one thing I want to just point out is what's missing from this whole thing here. God said to the human, he has become like us. God sent him from the Garden of Eden. He drove the human out. What's missing from that? Who's missing? It's Eve. Eve out of the story at this point. The punishment isn't on her, it's on Adam. It's an interesting thing. Well, we'll move forward a little bit in the story, past the primeval stories into the story of Abraham.
Do you want to ask if there's any comments
Yeah.
at this point?
Why don't we stop? Why don't we stop here and ask that question? As anybody have comments or questions or whatever up until now?
Don, this is so fascinating. I've done a lot of study of these stories, and you're pointing out stuff that I just never thought of. Like, for instance, that God only throws Adam out of the garden. And I think so much of this is really psychologically significant.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that your impetus for putting this together in a psychological framework, I think, is just so wise, and I thank you for that.
There have been some people who've traveled this path before, like Edinger and Murray Stein and even Marie-Louise von France. But you don't see it much. You have to go searching for it. And I wanted to dive deeper. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting you made this comment about the ancient Hebrews had this thing about blood. And that, of course, comes up in the Red Book, and it comes up in Lament for the Dead, which is the book that is the series of lectures or a series of conversations between James Hillman and Sonu Shamdasani about the Red Book.
It's a really good book too, the Lament of the Dead. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I certainly didn't notice the blood before, but after that, I have noticed it, and it's interesting that you made that comment.
Yeah.
Any other comments before?
Even when
I have one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, Randy.
So you're calling attention to the and
Mm-hmm.
made me think of, I work with improvisation in literature, and that rhetorical figure is called polysyndeton.
Mm.
And it is very typical of oral speech. For example, Huck Finn, that's how he talks.
Mm.
It's, we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this. And I think you're right, dependent on orality. But my mind also goes to, improvisation as a literary form. I'm not sure quite what to do with it yet, but I'm glad you pointed it out that it's there in Genesis.
I think it'll come up again, and unless I took that slide out, I'll see it again today. Oh yes,
Good.
oh, no, we will. We'll see it when.
I also
further into the.
Something?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. As you were reading, the women seemed to represent a great deal of creativity. It's quite a thing to be able to speak to a snake, and that the snake can speak to you, and you can understand the language together. It was just how you put them all together, each one representing something that we all really have, which is that ability to be creative in quite an unusual way that is out of the ordinary.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. And I just mentioned on that point that in the Bhagavad Gita, there is the issue of people being able to speak to animals. And I'm wondering if that isn't a reference to an intuitive power to understand what animals want to say to us. And that's one thought. And the other point I wanted to make was about the yellow ribbon. I'm wondering what you think about that yellow ribbon and its relationship to putting a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree.
That's a good question, and I don't know. I believe it came from a song, right? But where did that come from? Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I can't even say it to you without becoming emotional, and because I've been in a position where people have tied the yellow ribbon for me.
Skip, I have a point to make.
Go ahead.
John, this is very fascinating. You're bringing in some new material. So like it's new to me about Lilith. I didn't know he had a first wife, but then again, you know, I grew up Catholic, so probably we've got different Bibles here. So what really struck me was when you showed me that picture of Lilith. And I said, wow, doesn't that look like Angelina Jolie and Maleficent? So it's kind of like sneaking up subconsciously or subliminally, you know, this Lilith character. And I thought that was kind of cool. Another part was, this question about Adam to die. And what is the meaning of that? Well, of course, when he ate the apple, that's the threat that he's going to die. Well, it's all about the dying of the innocent, and now he's not innocent. He's worldly, and that it was Eve that now, we all hear the story that Eve tempted him with the apple, but that Eve gave him the apple and Adam ate it. Well, that means that Adam was kind of passive about it. Eve was more active. And you just mentioned that, men have the authority, but women have the power. And I don't know who the other one on the panel who mentioned about creativity, the dialogue between Eve and the serpent. Well, that to me shows a lot of power, and she's the initiator rather than seeing women as the subservient. It's the opposite. So it's kind of like a playing of a yin yang thing here going on with creation. It's a little bit messy, but then that's what life is. There's a lot of messiness going on. So anyway, thank you.
That's what I say about nature a lot. It's beautifully messy, and that's one of the best things about it, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Jackson. My name's Miles.
Hi, Miles.
I sort of feel like my life is a number of tarot cards being offered to me, and I'm to play them. So with that in mind, one of the things I've done is when I first heard somebody tweet out that Eve in ancient texts is actually referred to as a rescuer rather than a helper, I thought, okay, let's go to BibleGateway.com, and I think there's over like 30 different versions of the Bible. And of all of those, I think there was one that didn't use the word helper, which is rather a diminishing, subservient type of a term as compared to rescuer. So that's really curious. Now, the other thing, the way I read this section about God interrogating Adam and Eve, in fact, the only person who's being deceptive is Adam. Eve is actually saying, I was beguiled by the serpent, by chaos. Adam's the one who's obfuscating. He's being deceptive. He's not answering the question. And he's passing the buck, saying, oh, it's the woman you sent me. So it seems to be in keeping that Adam is being primarily chastened by being pushed out of the garden. So I'm thinking there's a time now for the word skip has provided, which I'm not necessarily going to say correctly, an antinomia where men have to become the helper. And indeed, woman is the rescuer. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah, cool. All right.
John, I'm wondering about where it says, let us make man in our image, the us of God, the our of God. Do you have thoughts on that? The multiplicity there.
That's a good question. And it only shows up here, really. Different people have made different things of it. Some people think, as with all things, the people that put the Hebrew Bible together had a particular message, a particular thing that they were trying to say, and they used these old stories to do it. But sometimes the older things bleed through. Maybe this is reflecting a time when things weren't so monotheistic in people's minds and in the stories that they told. That's one possibility. LDS, the Mormons, will tell you that God does have a wife, but we don't talk about her. And what they will all say, and this is a curious thing, in order to protect her. So was there, and who in the book of Job, the council that's going on there? I don't know. I think it's probably most likely old material coming through into a monotheistic story. But it's a worthy question to ask and something worthy to think about, I think. Okay, shall we continue?
Yes,
Take a little bit
yes.
of a, we'll come out of the what they call the primeval stories and step into the Abraham story. And I'll show you the family tree at one point and how this is one big family that we're hearing about for many chapters at the end of Genesis. But right at the beginning of it, Hagar is an interesting character. She was an Egyptian slave of Sarah, who was Abraham's wife. And despite those promises, of many promises that Abraham and his seed would be multiplied, like the stars in the sky, like the sand on the beach, Sarah's not able to conceive. She gets quite old. She offers Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate womb. Now, the way things were in those days, if you gave a slave to your husband and the slave had a child, it's your child. It's not the slave's child. So this actually is a child for Sarah and Abraham, according to the regulations and the rules at the time. But when Hagar gets pregnant, she gets haughty, she gets arrogant, like it is her child. And Sarah is not happy with that. She starts to abuse her. Hagar runs away, but she's stopped and sent back by an angel who tells her, name the child Ishmael. There's actually two different versions from two different sources of the story. One of them, Hagar is pregnant. The other one, she's already given birth when she runs off and is sent back. But anyway, she's sent back to do what she's supposed to do, which is to give birth for a child for Sarah. But then, after that child is born, then Sarah does get pregnant and gives birth to Isaac, and she then sees Isaac mocking, or sees Ishmael mocking Isaac at one point, and she convinces Abraham to banish Hagar and Ishmael to the desert, which they are, and they are then rescued by God. Islam considers Hagar to be Abraham's second wife, and according to Islamic tradition, she is named the grandmother of Arabians. Some rabbinical traditions believe that Hagar was Pharaoh's daughter, and Islam believes that Pharaoh gave her to Abraham when he still thought that Sarah was only Abraham's sister. If you remember, they went down there. He did this, and then Isaac did it at another point where they lied. Well, actually, Abraham wasn't lying because Sarah was his sister, but he was pretending that she wasn't his wife. And Pharaoh was very upset about that and felt that Abraham had caused him to sin, basically, because of the deception. In Galatians 4:30, the Apostle Paul says, "Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share the inheritance with the free woman's son." Pope Urban II used that text to justify the First Crusade to the Holy Land, to oust the Arabs. Black feminists consider Hagar essentially a black slave. One scholar says the story of Sarah and Hagar reveals ethnic prejudice exacerbated by economic and social exploitation. She's a powerful figure, and even though she steps out of the Hebrew Bible, she steps into a whole another huge world of Islam and the whole belief system, a major mother figure. Now we step a little bit further into the Abraham story, and we have the story of Rebecca. And she enters the story after the death of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Abraham is remarried to a woman named Keturah at that point. And there are some traditions that believe that this was actually Hagar, that Abraham went back to get her, but most people believe this was a different woman. He and Keturah have 5 sons, but the text says Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac. And to the sons of Abraham's concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still alive and sent them away from Isaac, his son, eastward to the land of the east. Basically, Abraham does not want his son to marry a Canaanite. So he sends his servant, well, he sends all his other sons away. And then he sends his servant back to the land of his birth to select a bride from his own family. Now, if you look on this, if you look at the orange portion, way down at the bottom, there's the city of Ur. That's where Abraham is from. That's where he was born. That's where he grew up. And after his father died, the family moved up to the just above the top of the orange to Haran. And it's in Haran that Abraham had his vision of God saying that he should go to Canaan, and which was down in around the area of Jerusalem in the pink down below there. This is the Fertile Crescent, and there's so much that happens in history through this. So when it says that Abraham sent all his concubines' sons east, it's not through the desert. They go up and around into this area. So anyway, the servant goes, I believe the servant actually goes to Haran because that's where family settled after the death of the father. So Rebecca is Abraham's grandniece, and the servant meets her at a well where she gives him water and waters his animals. He puts a ring in her nose, it says, bracelets on her arms, and pays her father 10 gold shekels. The deal's not settled yet, but this is stating his intent. This is another example of the storytelling, and it's a great example. And I've taken out the dialogue, but we can see it again. And she came down to the spring and filled her jug and came back up. And the servant ran toward her and said, and she said, and she hurried and tipped down her jug on one hand and let him drink, and she let him drink his fill, and said, and she hurried and emptied her jug into the trough, and she ran again to the well to draw water and drew water for all his camels. Now the servant has just prayed to God that someone would come, it would be a sign that she would offer to give him water and water the camels. And she not only does that, she does it. Now there are 10 camels, and thirsty camels can drink up to 13 gallons each. This was not a small thing that Rebecca did. It was precisely the sign that the servant was looking for. Now, the Hebrew Bible repeatedly tells stories of barren women and second sons. Again, it's like the way they were mocking the patriarchy. They're mocking the system of first sons get everything. Time and time again. Isaac was Abraham's second son. And when Isaac marries Rebecca, now, it takes 20 years for her to get pregnant. It's another barren woman story. This happens again and again in this family. Rebecca finally does give birth to Jacob and Esau. The boys were twins, but Esau is born first. And Rebecca conspires then later to have Jacob steal the blessing from Esau. So the second son gets the blessing rather than the first. Again, they're mocking the long established Canaanite cultural pattern of firstborn inheritance. This is time of birth. And when her time was come to give birth, look, there were twins in her womb. The first one came out ruddy, like a hairy mantle all over. They called his name Esau. And then his brother came out, hand grasping Esau's heel, and they called his name Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. And as you go through these stories about Jacob and Esau, Esau is kind of a beast. He's hairy, he's kind of dull in some ways, whereas Jacob is very different. He's hairless, for one thing.
Could that be Neanderthal? Sorry, just interject.
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. It could be that it was done deliberately to make, to make a point about character. I'm not sure, but it's a good point. It's a good point. If you've had your DNA tested, you know that we're all a little bit Neanderthal, right? Some of us more than others. Okay, as the lads grew up, Esau was a man skilled in hunting, a man of the field. Jacob was a simple man, a dweller in tents. And Isaac loved Esau for the game that he brought him, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now a simple man is interesting. Some people say that that actually means a perfect man, that there was something sublime about Jacob's lifestyle, living in tents, the whole story that's involved there. But Isaac likes the meat, he likes the game, and he likes Esau, but Rebekah has different ideas. So at the end of the story of Abraham, or of Isaac, it happened that when Isaac was old, that his eyes grew too bleary to see, and there's this conversation, Rebekah overhears it, that Isaac says to Esau, go out and get some game and cook it and bring it back and I'll give you the blessing. And Rebekah says, nope, I'm going to stop this. Esau goes out. She goes to Jacob and says, listen to my voice when I command you. And I think we probably all know this story, that he put on fur on his arms and wore Esau's clothing so that he smelled like Esau, and goes to get the blessing. And Isaac is kind of suspicious, but he goes ahead and does it, and he gives the blessing to Jacob, which, you know, Esau is not happy about this, very unhappy about it. But it can't be taken back, and that's an interesting thing, that he can't take it back once it's been given. Jacob has the blessing, he has the inheritance now, well, the spiritual inheritance. This is the same Jacob who wrestled with the angel, you know, later in his life. And what does he say to that angel or to God? I won't let you go until you bless me. But he's already got the blessing. So what's interesting, what's up with the character of that man? What is he so unsure about? So Isaac gets older and he's going to die, and Esau has held off, but he's going to kill Jacob once Isaac is gone. Rebecca knows this, and she warns Jacob and sends him back home, you know, to the family home, her brother Laban, and convinces Isaac to send him there so that Jacob won't marry a Hittite. It's the same thing that happened with Isaac. They're not going to marry a local woman. There are many in the Hebrew Bible. There's time and time again it said, don't marry the locals, don't marry the foreigners, don't marry people of a different religion. And yet it happens all the time, but not in these early stories. It's very interesting. But a lot of those patriarchs were married to foreigners, and that's what a lot of the stories are about. So here's the family tree. See Terah up at the top, and then if you come down the left-hand side, you see there that Abraham and Sarah are in fact brother and sister. They had Isaac. Now Isaac is married to Rebecca, and they have Esau and Jacob. And now we're talking about Jacob going back to the family. Come straight across from Rebecca, you see Laban. And he's going to marry Rachel, but there's more to the story. Rachel's older sister Leah and a couple of other women. He has children with all four of these women, and those are the 12 tribes of Israel. Let's look at Rachel. Jacob flees to his uncle Laban to escape Esau's rage. He falls in love with Laban's daughter Rachel. He's made to work for 7 years for Laban to marry her. But at the last moment, overnight, when the veil is on, Laban puts his first daughter, Leah, and that's who Jacob marries. And he's not very happy about it, but then Laban says, okay, but if you work another 7 years, you can have Rachel. Well, okay, so he marries Rachel and then works another 7 years to pay for her. Genesis says that Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, but surprise, she couldn't get pregnant. So Leah gives birth to 4 sons, the first wife. Rachel then gives Jacob her slave, Bilhah, as a surrogate mother. So those children are technically Rachel's children. Bilhah gives birth to 2 sons that Rachel named and raised. Leah then gives Jacob her slave, Zilpah, who gave birth to 2 more sons. And again, technically, those are now Leah's children, not the slave's children. And Rachel eventually gave birth to Joseph, finally, who becomes Jacob's favorite son. This is the same Joseph of the coat of many colors, who was sold into slavery into Egypt, which ends up being the thing that saves the day as we go in, as we go out of Genesis into Exodus. So Rachel gave birth to Joseph. Jacob then secretly seeks to escape from Laban, takes all 12 of his kids, both wives, and tries to go back to Canaan. But Rachel stole her father's religious idols. And Laban is furious, and he comes looking. He searches the entire camp. But Rachel is sitting in her tent, and she's put them under herself. She's sitting on these idols. And when Laban comes in, she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't get up. I'm on my period." And he is suspicious, but he goes away. And it's an interesting aspect in the story. Not knowing who it was, Jacob curses whoever it was that stole Laban's idols. And lo and behold, the curse comes true when Rachel dies in childbirth. She gives birth to Benjamin, who is the only one of Jacob's sons that was not born or was born in Canaan. The others were all born back in the homeland. And Rachel dies. So Jacob's 12 sons, as I said, gave rise to the 12 tribes of Israel. The Assyrians came down and conquered the 10 northern tribes of Israel around 720 BCE, including the tribe of Benjamin. This is many, many centuries. Several centuries way after these stories. But the tribe of Benjamin, the 10 northern tribes are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They're gone. They were destroyed, taken into captivity and spread about by Assyria. The prophet Jeremiah later, at the time of the Babylonian, destruction of the temple and the other 2 tribes taken into captivity, he writes, Rachel is weeping for her children, the tribe of Benjamin, and refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. And this story is also evoked in the New Testament when Herod kills all of the children 2 years and younger. Mary and Joseph, their child, and escape to Egypt. Rachel is weeping for her children. So these stories carry forward. Everybody thinks about them. I think another story from the Abraham saga, Tamar. Judah was one of the sons of Jacob, one of the 11 sons that sold Joseph into slavery. Well, Tamar marries Judah's oldest son, and however, because he was wicked, but we don't know what, is killed by God. So Tamar is a widow. Now, in those days, it's an obligation of the next brother of the dead man to marry his brother's widow, or at least to get her pregnant and have children, because that would be the dead man's son. It's a surrogate father, the same way that there was a surrogate womb. It's the other side of the equation. This is called levirate or levirate marriage. Judah tells his next son, Onan, to impregnate Tamar for this very reason, so that can have children and that Tamar can have children. However, he doesn't want to do it because if he does that, he loses some of his inheritance. He's in a position to get a big portion of the estate because he's the oldest son now. So he doesn't want to do it. He does go in and he has sex with Tamar, but then he pulls out and ejaculates onto the floor. And God is not happy about that, and so he kills Onan. Judah refuses then to let his youngest son, Shelah, marry Tamar, thinking that she's cursed. He doesn't know that God has killed these 2 sons of his. But anyway, he tells Tamar, just wait, when he's older, we'll do that. But she realizes with time that that's not going to happen. So Tamar waits. Eventually, Judah's wife dies. And then Tamar learns that Judah is planning to go to a place called Timnath, and she disguises herself as a prostitute and goes there ahead of him. She's in a position of having nothing. She's an extra in the family at this point. She doesn't have children. She's not married. Anyway, she goes and intercepts Judah on the road. And Judah has sex with her, but does not recognize that it's Tamar. He gives her his staff and his seal, says, well, I'll come back and I'll bring you a goat as payment. And she says, fine. He goes off. She takes off and keeps the staff and the seal. And she does get pregnant. And when her pregnancy is discovered, Judah accuses Tamar of being a prostitute and orders that she is burned to death. But of course, she's got the seal and the staff, and she sends the seal to Judah and says, this belongs to the man that got me pregnant. Judah recognizes them as his own. And so now Tamar's position is secured. She eventually gives birth to twin boys, one of whom is an ancestor of King David and therefore an ancestor of Jesus. And that is how she got into the position that she got into. In those days, when Judah is looking for, he brought the goat back to pay her, and she's gone, and so he's going around. He doesn't want to ask too much. Where is the that was here? Well, Kadesha or Kedesha, they were a class of sacred prostitutes. So not prostitutes in the normal sense. These are temple prostitutes, part of the religion, the worship of Baal or of the goddess Astarte or Ashtoreth. This was very common and very widespread in the surrounding community. And this is part of what the Hebrews were up against with their monotheistic patriarchy. There was a deliberateness about that, to not worship in this way. And yet it keeps coming in, and it keeps coming back in these stories again and again. On the other hand, Kadesha also is a term sometimes used for public women. And these are women that would go and sit by the road, as exactly what Tamar did, and they would offer their services, either breastfeeding, I can breastfeed for you, or I can be a midwife, or other things that had to do with the world of women. Virgins and married women were not allowed to do that. But that's exactly what Tamar did when she fooled her father-in-law into getting her pregnant and being a surrogate father for Ur. That's a good place to stop for a moment if you want to, because that's the end of the Abraham stories. If anybody has comments or discussion. I think these are interesting stories because they're not what you would expect. The relationships, the sex, the violence, the deaths. I mean, it's just, they're unusual stuff, and the ways in which women used their positions to create history, basically. Yeah.
Also, the role of trickery,
which
seems to be accepted because it works.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if David, he's a twin. Is he first or second born of the twins?
Of David?
Yeah. You said he was a twin. I didn't know that.
Jacob and Esau were twins.
I misheard. I thought you said David was also a twin. My mistake.
Yeah, David was the youngest son of several brothers. Yeah. Anybody else?
Nice people.
I've got something to add. So back at the slide where we saw Rebecca, we see a real commodification of woman, and has had a ring put in her nose, and she's also sold.
Yes.
Now, I think it was Lewis provided a quote that's really struck me and stuck with me, and that is, the absurd requires meaning and the meaning requires absurd. So if we can sit with absurd and not get too bent out of shape about it when I say what I'm going to say. About a year ago, I encountered some people who said that, we are really creatures meant to be plant eaters. We're herbivores, we're not omnivores. And in fact, one of the absurdities that I'll share, you can take it or leave it, is that to target oil, gas, and coal as the #1 ecological threat or factor is wrong. It's actually industrial animal agriculture, meat and dairy. So at some point we went from eating the trees, the fruits that were described in the Genesis 1, to eating animal flesh. Now, I'm not vegan, but I'm veganish, and I'm starting to appreciate that there is maybe quite a bit to that. And this commodification of life and animals is at such a point now that we are quickly losing the wild animals. And it's like almost, I think it's 80% of wildlife is, or 80% of life are cows, pigs, chickens, and humans. So anyway, just sharing that for what you might think about it.
It's interesting because what you're referring to is the original plan. The original plan in Genesis was vegetarian. It changed. It changes after the flood for practical reasons. The original plan is not for death. The original plan is not pain in childbirth. The original plan is not that she be subservient. None of that was God's original plan. It's very interesting to think of it like that. What we're living in is not the original.
Plan B.
Plan B. Plan B or C or D or whichever. Right? So
I just want to mention, John, the movie Harmonia.
Oh, yes.
An Israeli movie from 2016 about the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. It's a really beautiful movie if you get a chance to see that.
Yeah, Harmonia. It's a great film, Israeli film.
Mm-hmm. Subtitle.
Set in modern times. Abraham is an orchestra conductor, and the two women are members of the orchestra, and they do have their children, and it's fascinating. I love that film. Yeah.
John?
Yes.
Yes, again. Again, I'm learning, so thank you. What's this about this public women? They're considered prostitutes and seen as, low class, or are they seen as, women who are entrepreneurs and looking for a way to, make a living if they're going to be providing service here for breastfeeding or midwifery? I mean, how did they elevate women, or they put them down in second class chattel property? Can you comment on that? During that time, now this is a culture, right? So this is,
it's a culture.
Going back.
Yeah. It's interesting because I do mention it a little bit further if we get that far today. But whenever you have stories of women that were actually prostitutes in the Old Testament, they're treated with respect. They have a standing. They have a place in society. The two women that came to Solomon about the baby and said, it's mine, and he says, well, I'll cut it in half. Right? They're two prostitutes, and they're treated with respect. He listens to them and he considers, okay, whatever. And this does keep coming in and out of the story. And sometimes I think it's in the story and we don't realize it. We have to understand what the story is about, like with Jezebel, what her situation was. But yeah, I think it's a culture. It's something that just is, and you could see from the stories that the patriarchs partook of that.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned when I was doing a lot of traveling in the Middle East is that the custom of having multiple wives doesn't come from prurience. It comes from the fact that, you know, even as recently as 50 or 100 years ago, there was no help for destitute people in these countries, and that especially in the Arabian Peninsula, it was very common for the men to go off to war and not come back. And so men who were men of means took on another woman as a form of you know, civic help, and they were always treated with respect. Supposedly they're supposed to be treated the same as the other wives, and so, you know, we didn't have, or there wasn't public welfare before the last 50 or 100 years, and so people had to make it somehow. And especially in the Arabian Peninsula, where the men kept getting killed off, and the women were there with children and maybe didn't have a way to support themselves. This was public welfare, in a sense, or private welfare. But
yeah, like you say, from the man's standpoint, from the men's world, they were treated. They had equal status.
Right.
They were treated. In the world of women, however, I think in that world, we've already seen in these stories that there is definitely a hierarchy of
yeah,
who's number one and who has the power and who doesn't in that world. But that's not coming from the men. It's a respectable, you know, position. You know.
Right, and even in the harem of Istanbul, where they said, you know, 400 wives were kept. In most of Islam, it's only 4, but the Sultan supposedly had 400. But it was very common for the women to kill off the children of their competitors. And that was also true in ancient Japan as well. That the reason that women are shown in imagery of ancient Japan and in Hakata dolls and so on with knives is because they needed to be armed in order to protect themselves and their own children in these harems. And so it was just a practical way of living, basically, until really recently. I mean, and not Japan necessarily, but certainly in the Middle East, we're talking about the middle of the 20th century. Places like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states.
The multiple wives thing really expanded in the Hebrew stories, in the Bible stories. Particularly when you get to let's see, somebody needs to be muted, I think. Anyway, Solomon had an international. I mean, Solomon, you know, after David, Solomon's son, and had an international reputation and an international government. And he's said to have 300 wives himself, but I don't think they were all wives in the sense. I mean, these were political arrangements that he would marry someone from this country or from that place. And, you know, now we have a treaty and agreement and whatnot. He also had, I forget how many concubines. It was a huge, huge number. But that doesn't mean that they were cohabitating or necessarily involved as wives, other than as a political arrangement. It's interesting. I mean, it's a culture. It's a different way. It was a different thing.
Right on.
Yeah. We can continue if you want. going to step into Exodus with this next story of Miriam.
I could just add one thing I really feel the need to share. If we go back to Genesis and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Oppenheimer, when he witnessed the first atomic explosion, I can't remember the quote, but something like, "Oh my God, what have I done?" kind of thing. I've unleashed the power of God, something to that effect. It is interesting to me that if you look at a pool of stored nuclear fuel rods that have been removed from the reactor because they're not quite efficient enough anymore, they glow with a very beautiful blue color for quite some time. I forget the actual name of the radiant effect. Also, when you think about a lot of the nuclear isotopes like plutonium, it's not terribly dangerous to you as long as it's outside of your body, but if you ingest it, it'll kill you. And of course, it's toxic for 250,000 years. So there is that reference about in what you read today with respect to having eaten it, you're now tasted death, so to speak. Anyway, just a few thoughts on that.
Yeah. I wanted to ask one question, John. If I recall, the Abrahamic story is something like 1500 BCE, and of course the Hagar Ishmael story is the base story of Islam. In other words, when people go on the Hajj, they're literally reliving the story of Hagar. Okay, and when they go to the Kaaba, they're actually circling around a well that was given to Hagar by God, supposedly. Right. Okay, so we're talking about something that happened 1500 BCE, but the prophet, peace be upon him, lived in 640 AD, so 2,000 years later. Is there any sense of have you seen any literature about what transpired in that 2,000 years?
I don't know how to answer in detail. I believe tradition says that he was a descendant of Ishmael, so I believe that's correct, right? But beyond that,
yeah, I'm not well enough informed of that. I have a Quran in my bookshelf, but I don't know it well enough to say. I'll have to study up on that. I was just looking for easy answer, but there are no easy answers in the world.
Yeah, that part of the world was Arab for centuries, millennia. Yeah, really. Yeah. Just, sure. And even up into Spain, southern France.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. That's the story of El Cid and so on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
We've heard quite a bit about the Genesis and women in the Bible as stories, but we haven't heard anything yet about the Old Testament being divine revelation and prophecy and the Word of God. And I would be quite interested in hearing something about that. For example, the role of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in each of these women as not being simply stories told around a campfire someplace, but actually divine revelation and prophecy of God to the Jewish people.
No, I appreciate the question, and I understand what it is that you're asking. I am not a believer myself, so I don't have the answer I think that you're asking for. Traditionally, these stories are thought to have really happened and to have been true stories of an actual people and an actual God that works in history. There's a lot of questions now as to the, how historical are these stories, or were they stories that were used by the Hebrews to make a point? So that's about as far as I can answer that question.
And I'd ask the question, how far back do they really go? I mean, we know that they were probably written down starting about 1500 BCE or maybe a little bit before. But for example, in India, the Bhagavad Gita is reputed to be 2,000 years old, but it's based on oral tradition that goes back at least 5,000 years. And I have a speculation that it goes back much farther than that. I speculate that it goes back to before 15,000 AD, and I have good reason for that question.
The Ice Age.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason I have that speculation is because the story of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a story of good and evil, of course, but it also appears in Native American tradition. And in order for it to be part of Native American tradition, it would have had to come to North America and then to South America before 11,700 BC, which is when the Bering Land Bridge evaporated, apparently, one way or another about that time. So the stories would have had to come with them before 11,700 BC. And so I just think that's an interesting thing to wonder about, how old these stories really are.
Isn't that what the collective unconscious is about?
Yeah. Yeah, probably. Well,
but myth
is part of it. Yeah.
You'll never find a historical foundation for any myth.
Right.
You have in the you have the story of the flood in the Old Testament. Well, that doesn't mean that some Jew said, "Oh, let's take this story from Babylon," because the same story of the flood is found in Central America, in other parts of the world. The Bible, the Old and New Testament, are expressions of the human soul. We're going to spend our time just trying to prove the historicity of these stories. It's a fool's errand. You'll prove the existence of Moses, of Christ, of Buddha, or of Muhammad. It'll never happen. You might as well live on a diet of a bowl of sawdust followed by a gallon of prune juice. I just don't see what the point is if it's not going to be accepted, or that divine revelation prophecy is going to be considered. What's the point of reading the Bible, or what is there left of the Jewish people and their heritage? It really is treating them like intellectual and moral imbeciles.
Right, but this is what the religion departments in universities do.
It is the academic world, and particularly since the Age of Enlightenment, and enter the Age of Aquarius, where it's not just anti-Christ, it's anti-religion, anti-Christianity, the breaking down of secular institutions and religious institutions. I just don't see the point of trying to go through and prove everything historically. And it makes no sense that the Old and New Testament could endure for thousands of years when you could take any number of academics, lock them up in a room and tell them, use all of your knowledge and come out of there with a story or a group of stories that's going to endure 2,000 to 4,000 years. That won't happen because it's simply not understood that the soul is real and that these so-called stories are expressions of the human soul. And that, by the way, there are a lot of Jewish people who do not believe and don't acknowledge from the beginning that these were all historical events. Philo the Jew, for example, gives a far more beautiful rendition in his story of the creation than I've heard so far. But in any event, that's just my view. I don't get the point of.
Well, just so we're clear where I'm coming from, I do believe in divine revelation, and but I'm interested in finding the sources of these stories, mainly because, as Dr. Jung pointed out, there are many common themes in all the world's religions. And if we can find those common things and our common humanity in all those religions, then we don't have to kill each other over them anymore. And that's a very practical consideration for me as a retired military man, that I would like humanity to stop killing one another over religion. And so my quest is to demonstrate the similarity of these stories across the human species, leaving aside the issue of revelation, which I acknowledge to you is a reasonable one, and I concur with you on your point. But just so you understand my point, and Thomas Ars made this beautiful comment about religion departments, which I'll share with you for a moment here. It says, nothing causes greater tedium and disregards the central questions of our time more than the ignorance and prevailing bustle witnessed within the self-referential and detail-obsessed chairs of our university institutions. In all likelihood, nothing revelatory will come from their discourse. And so your point is well taken, that the religion departments are, talking about how many angels are on the head of a pin without understanding what an angel is. So,
or who created the pin?
Or pardon?
Or who created the pin?
Correct. Right. So anyway, I feel your pain, but there is also a reason to have the discourse about these earlier issues, because they relate to our species at its origins. So
can I just add something too?
Yeah, please.
Maxie, your comments are really very right on. And a lot of all this that's being shared by Jon is just to gleam over, we're gleaming over a span of what, 2,000 plus years. And we can't really take it by facts, but we get a flavor of what it was like back then. And we can understand what it was in the past about their culture and contrast it with what it is today. And that therefore appreciate the progress that we've made. And maybe also maybe not, there's certain areas that we did not make much progress in, but there's still that archetype that still lingers on, even, that is still fresh back then as it is today. So I'm just kind of enjoying the story. And I just want to, say thank you, Jon, for, bringing up some really interesting areas of, interpretation from different Bibles, and perspective. So this is a wonderful opportunity with all the people here in the panel and people listening to just think about it and reflect on it and how it seems to bring meaning and appreciation of our life today.
I might also point out that it has great relevance, at least in the 20th century, because, the Jews went through the Holocaust. And when they were living in the ghetto in Warsaw, they had their Old Testament. They read it. It was a source of inspiration. They prayed about it. They carried copies of the Old Testament as they hopped on the trains to be taken to Auschwitz. It was this that held them like glue as they walked into the furnaces. And if these are just non-revelatory books, academics to peer at with the Faustian intellect, it does not explain both why it has endured so long, or why people would hold it so dearly, even as they walked into death. I think that we're catching a lot of the tree limbs, but we're missing the forest. Well, that's my view.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, the question then arises, how do we get to the forest? So if you have thoughts about that, we can organize some other featured speakers on that.
Yeah, I have no problem saying that I believe that these stories are alive, and
definitely
stories that come from and speak to the soul. And I believe the stories carry that in them, so that as we experience the stories, that aliveness comes into us, which is, that stories stand on their own. Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. Absolutely none. So, John, let me just ask, about where are you in talking about the women? If you're like halfway.
We're past the halfway point, but we can stop anytime. There's not a problem.
Would you like to do a second part 2 weeks hence and pick up with Miriam at that point, or do you want to go for it? If you want to go for it, I'm game.
Well, let's see what other people say.
What do others think?
I wouldn't mind splitting it into another session. Part of my experience with this really rich material is I kind of get tired intellectually.
Yeah.
And I feel like the shorter the session is, the more I can really focus in on each different session. Right now, my mind is just swimming with all this material. It's just so rich.
There's a lot, and I understand what you're talking about, because it is a lot.
Yeah. Let me just ask Susan Scott, though, if she has any further comments about this part of this story, or if others do, since this is the part that had Lilith in it, I especially wanted to give Susan an opportunity, since she's coming to us from the southern tip of South Africa. We have to unmute you. You have to unmute yourself, Susan.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Good, good. Thanks, Skip. And John, thank you so much. And to everybody who's, the participants who've put up interesting bits of information. It's just been, for me, completely fascinating. The trickery and the deception, that has been used to foster an ultimate goal. They're such complex stories, really. The Lilith story, as you well know, is one that I'm very much at home with. But, you know, these women so far have had, you know, something of the subversive about them. And I don't mean that in any derogatory way at all. That what I'm saying is that sometimes those acts of subversion are necessary. You know, and a bit of deceit and deception and trickery that furthers the story. So that's really all I have to say, but I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this, really and truly, and thank you to the hosts who facilitated it. And I know that I will be watching it again to pick up on anything I may have missed out. But the one thing to me that's interesting about Jacob Esau is that Esau forfeited his birthright. You know, it's a complicated story. Jacob tricked Esau into giving up his birthright as the firstborn son. And my understanding is that Jacob became the patriarch of the Israelites and Esau of the Palestinians. And I'm not sure if Palestinians is the right term. The Israelites and the, I don't know, the Ishmaelites, I'm not sure, the Palestinians. And to me, you know, I mean, the Bible says something about Rebecca being told by God that in her womb there are two nations, and the elder will serve the younger. And in my view, that's a metaphor for, you know, Israel and the Palestinian ongoing conflict. So, you know, this is what these stories are for me, metaphors, you know, that are just rich in their symbolism. So thank you for the opportunity for me to say that.
You're quite welcome.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I don't understand how Esau forfeited his birthright. Can you illuminate that?
You know, I'd have to go back to the books, but it's always been something that has struck me. There was, it's a particular story of Jacob and Esau. You know, Esau was very angry with Jacob, but you must go and look it up, I think, for yourself.
Yeah.
But
Jacob was cooking a stew, and Esau came in from hunting.
Yes.
And he said, "Give me some of that red stuff. I'm famished. I'm starving." And Jacob said, "Well, give me the birthright." And he said, "Well, I don't need a birthright. I'm dying. You know, give me the stew." And it was one of those examples of how it's another illustration of him being so beast-like that the only important thing is that red stew. You know.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank
he does.
You for the reminder.
He gives up the birthright. You know, right
he
then.
gives his birthright for a bowl of pottage.
Yes. Yeah, for a little pottage, exactly. Exactly. And so, yes, so, you know, those are the sons, you know, we're not talking about the women right now, but yes, all this intrigue and drama and messiness, as you said earlier, you know, not unlike what goes on today. Different scale.
And this drama has been used, the drama has been used for 2,000 years, 2,500 years to shape our politics.
Similar dynamics, different time, place, circumstance, and so on. But that dynamic is ever present, ever since, well, You know, I mean, Adam blamed Eve, Eve blamed the serpent, and we've been blaming each other ever since and not being accountable and owning our own actions. So I think these stories are incredibly rich and psychologically, you know, enormously educational. You know, if we can look at them in a way other than, you know, is it truth, is it fact, does it matter? I don't think it matters that much. You know, when is a fact a truth? You know, when is the truth a fact? No, I don't think there's an answer to that. But if the stories are looked at metaphorically, then we can derive enormous, what's the right word? Enormous insight, I think, into our psyche.
You know, what you said a moment ago about life, it reminds me of, this happened so many times in my life as a psychiatrist. I mean, as a therapist, deep into somebody's life story, their complicated story, and this and that, and, you know,
and the ands and the ands and
the ands and the ands, and then sometimes I would just sit there and I would look at them and I'd say, wow, it's just like real life.
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, it's so true. This is real life. It's real life.
Yep. Yep. I must say I'd also be happy if it were divided, John, into a second session from Hagar onwards. I agree that the material is so rich that, you know, one needs time to digest it. You know, that's my feeling.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
And thank you.
So that brings up the question then, John, when would you like to come back?
I'll come in 2 weeks, since I already have the material prepared. Yeah.
Okay, terrific.
Happiness.
Yeah. Sherry can watch me reading my books again.
Yeah. Okay, and let's also talk about whether there's more to talk about in the Old Testament after the women as well, but you and I can take that up offline. Tim, did you have anything more?
Well, gosh, we could spend forever just on the Old Testament. There's so much material in there, and there's so many different ways of slicing it. You know, I've gone to a little bit of seminary, and I've read tons of books about this, and the material that you've given us, John, is a lot of it is stuff I've never heard before, and it's just so fascinating to go back, you know, to dig deep into our own cultural history and pull out these things and re-examine them in a new light. I'm just so appreciative.
I'm really grateful that I've had the opportunity to prepare these lectures and then to give them here. I mean, it's just what you say. I mean, it's to delve so deeply into this material, into myself, into the whole experience of it. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Yeah. I'm just looking, we haven't really heard from Jan Claire today, and I'm just looking at a chat that she put on the Zoom session, which is a reference to Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell said, "It's been tough on serpents too. One day Snake said, we too should eat these fruits. Why must we go hungry?" Antelope said, "But we don't know anything about this fruit." Then man and his wife took some of the fruit and ate it. Anambata came down from the sky and asked, "Who ate the fruit?" They answered, "We did." Anambata asked, "Who told you that you could eat that fruit?" And they replied, "Snake did." It's the same story. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yes, I think I know that story. I'll look it up again. It's a lovely story.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so thank you so much for being here again with us, John. And I'll put it forward on the schedule. And is there anything anyone else want to say at this point? Okay. Then I just want to remind everyone that Ann Belford-Ulanoff will be speaking to us on Sunday.
Yeah.
And she's been a little bit apprehensive about the technology, but she's game on the activity, and actually also brought in another friend of hers who is going to be very important also, which is Jill Mellick, who has written the book, the Red Book Hours, which looks to be a very rich book, especially from an artist point of view or a creative point of view. So I'm looking forward to that as well. But, you know, in the immediate future, we have Ann Belford-Ulanoff this Sunday. The following Saturday, or no, 2 weeks from Saturday, we have Melissa Townsend again to talk about the Tarot and her 2 decks of the Tarot. And then on Sunday, that Sunday, August 9th, we have Murray Stein going to speak to us. And they have Chiron has just published this book, which is Map of the Soul 7, which is persona, shadow, and ego in the world of BTS. And this, of course, is a reference to the Korean group BTS, which has been doing Jungian themes for several years now in their albums. And Murray Stein, Steve Busser, and Leonard Cruz have done a Jungian commentary in this book of all the songs of the last 2 major albums that BTS published. And this is important for the Jungian world because BTS has 80 million followers around the world, at least 80 million. And Miles was saying last night that they have 37 million followers on their YouTube channel, which is the population of Canada. But you know, what's very significant to me, and obviously Murray Stein and Laura London and others have picked up on it, Steve Busser and Leonard Cruz, is that, you know, they're getting this Jungian message out to the whole world, to people of every stripe. And so this is a very important development, it seems to me, in terms of Jungian thought for the 21st century. And then the following week we have Jill Mellick coming, and Randy Fertel and I are talking about a date for him to talk about the trickster, and that will be very interesting. And I've got a number of other invitations out pending, so we'll see what happens. So I hope to see you all on Sunday for Ann Belford-Ulanoff at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. on the West Coast, and 7 a.m. in Hawaii. Just, but that'll be a good one. So anyway, see you all Sunday. Thank you for being here today.
Thank
Peace.
you.
See you again soon. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.